Welcome to the Lightforge. This is ADWCTA.
This is Merps coming at you with another Lightforge. This one is pre-recorded. Today is August 30th. So
It is
if
Thursday
something
night.
crazy happens, between now and when this gets released, now you guys know why that crazy topic wasn't discussed.
Yeah. But yeah, we're releasing this at the normal time, so there may be a little gap. But the topic we're going to talk about today is not. It's a always topic. It's a every time topic, right? It's something that's going to affect you no matter what Blizzard does to the arena. Fingers crossed.
Yeah, definitely. So look, today we're going to talk about broadly self-improvement, right? This is something that we always try to provide some teaching lessons. And it's something that we hope that you guys get some educational content out of these podcasts as well.
See,
So
you call it self-improvement. I just wrote on here making mistakes.
I mean, we are going to be talking about mistakes that players make. So with this meta, the Boomsday meta, and how a lot of it is board centric, right? A lot of people just aren't used to it, or a lot of people have a tough time sort of like seeing what they're doing wrong,
Like
right?
I see so many posts. I mean, you go
Yeah.
back to like Witchwood, and there were a lot of posts, but that's because it went to a whole new bucketing system. But you go before that, and there's not like as many posts usually about not being able to adjust to the meta. Like the only times I've seen this many were when the big changes happened, right? Like when it went into standard with Ungoro, or when the system shifted to the bucket system with Witchwood. But this is a significant amount of people, and like generally like normally good players. They're struggling a little.
Yeah, definitely. So, all right, we want to help you guys out. And because the draft goes by bucketing now, we are going to bucket the advice as well. Exactly. So, we are going to, and also we're going to get a little bit of like BuzzFeedy on you guys and basically say, here are some common mistakes that beginners make, common mistakes that intermediate players make, and common mistakes that advanced players make. So, when you think of beginning players, these are people who, are kind of the casuals. Perhaps, you
So
average like 2 to 3
judgmental.
wins.
So judgmental. How many
I
listeners do you
know.
think that we have that are not casual? Well, they may be casual.
Oh yeah, they could
But that
definitely
they're
be
definitely
casual.
not beginners. And they're listening to the Lightforge podcast, and maybe they only average 3 wins per run. Maybe they're only average.
Maybe.
Like we say only, right? Maybe they're only beating half the people that they play against. Oh no, what a horrible fate to befall upon you to win half
Well,
your games.
to those people, I would say you can do better. And we're going to start today. So, look, when I say beginners, I'm not saying you just picked up this game a few days ago. To those people, I would say my advice is learn the cards. So, if you just picked up the game a few days ago, number one, learn the classes. Number two, learn the cards. And number three, just have a basic understanding of how the game goes. And then that's it. Okay, so if you began it a week ago, that's your advice. Like, that's your homework. Go do that first. Now, if you're actually someone who knows how the arena works and, and let's use a beginner tag for that, and perhaps average like, maybe 2 to 3 wins. Here are the most common mistakes that I see for beginner players, just from sort of coaching people, and also sometimes I watch like smaller streams as well, and I encounter people who are like no idea what they're doing with the arena, and I see these mistakes. So for beginner players, the first mistake that they make, and note what words I'm using, they don't acknowledge the next turn. Notice I didn't say planning the next turn. Like that comes later, but a lot of beginner players don't even acknowledge the next turn. So what's the difference between that? So planning the next turn that's a more advanced thing, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But you have to first just acknowledge the next turn, like the fact that the next turn can exist, right? Which means you have to just think it's like, oh, okay, like in a very fundamental level, it's like what can happen on the next turn.
By the next
So
turn, do you
like
mean your opponent's turn, or do you mean your next?
your opponent's turn and then your next
So
turn as
two
well.
turns, two
Two
turns are gonna
turns,
happen.
crazy.
That's
Because it's a cycle, right? So we can say you're not acknowledging the next cycle.
mm-hmm.
And all it can be is just sort of like you don't and you don't need to predict, you don't need to do advanced planning. It could just be the fact that, hey, his Boulder Fist Ogre can attack into my 5/5. That's an easy thing. Now, like that is a bad thing. And then you just take that into consideration, right? Like just
So
knowing
you're
that
telling
the
me
next
that
turn
when
will happen.
people are making their plays, they don't
Mhm.
acknowledge that there's a Boulder Fist Ogre on the opponent's side of the board and consider what options the Boulder Fist Ogre has the next turn, namely attack your face or attack your board.
People don't do that. Yes.
Okay. See, so
Um
I'm fully out of touch with all of this. So this is all news to me. Um, uh, but yeah, you should definitely consider that. It's actually the most easy thing to do because it's not a read. The Boulder Fist
it's not a
Ogre
read. No,
is
no, no.
already on
No.
the board,
Oh,
and
no, no.
your opponent is guaranteed to have a decision to make of where to attack. And you should consider what happens no matter which choice he makes, right? Like,
Yes, definitely. This is just you identifying and, like I said, acknowledging what is there and what is to come. That is it. That is it. Just do that and then base your decision on it. So it's not planning, it's acknowledging. Okay, so that's number one. Number two, a common mistake that beginner players make is just not drafting for a curve, right? And it could just be from watching streamers and they want to get a little bit fancier. But if you are a beginner player, um, one of the best things you can do is just draft a curve, right? And
mhm.
then let's say on pick 10 and on pick 20, just quickly reassess. It's like, okay, well, I want like 6 2 drops and I want 5 3 drops, etc. And then just see where you are in,
So it's
with that count.
it's statistically proven that relative to how they do with other cards, lower win rate players do better with curve cards. It's
Yes.
statistically proven. Why? Because there's less decisions when you're playing curve stuff. It's a little more about whether you draw your curve or not. So it's better for you, and it limits your world of decision making if you like try to opt into curve stuff. And with the new bucket system, well, not new, I guess, but with the bucket system, you're not going to miss out on a lot of value to just go for curve first. You also find, like, especially when I'm streaming, I notice this happens a lot. A lot of people in chat would want me to take, like, the cool cards or the fancy cards. And I will very, very often disappoint them and be like, yeah, it's the 12th pick. I only have 2 2 drops. I want another 2 drop here. Why? I'm not behind on 2 drops. If you're thinking, oh, I need 5 or 6 2 drops, I could easily take the higher value card and catch up on 2 drops later, but I may not be offered the chance, and then things would really suck. On the other hand, if I give up this, like, I don't know, 30 tier list points of value, and then later on I get offered more 2 drops, I could probably make up for that by shifting things into other drops I need and by, just otherwise taking something of a similar bucket, right? The next time you. So definitely favor your drops. I would say it's not even a terrible idea to literally draft your entire curve first and then worry about all the other cards. So, like, in your first, like, 10, 20 picks, anytime you're faced between a curve pick and a non curve pick, you always take the curve picks until you have a minimum, like, amount. Like, maybe, like, the number of cards you want on the curve minus one. And then you're allowed to, like, pick other cards.
Yep. So, um, if you're a beginner player, just always try to draft for a curve, right? And like play your curve as well. So the next
Hmm.
common mistake that I
Before
see
this,
beginner.
there was this question on our Reddit too. What is the curve? You keep
Oh,
saying
what is a curve?
draft a curve, not like what it is, but like, well, how many twos do you need? How many threes do you need? How many fours do you need?
So once again, the curve, right? When we talk about a curve, it could either be one, two, three, or if you're the second player, one of those turns you're gonna double up, right? So, but no matter what it is, it just means you want to use you want to use whatever mana like that's available to you or potentially available to you with the coin in an advantageous way to get yourself onto the board and establish the board, right? And it'll be different depending on the class as well. You know, when you ask how many twos do you need, for example, with Rogue, the hero power like helps you establish tempo as well, right? You know, not as much tempo as you would if you drafted like a really strong two drop, but still a pretty decent tempo play. So that depends on the class, like how many you need. But let's say you are a druid, right? And you want to play like fairly aggressively. I would say if you're a beginner player, try to go for like you know, like the 6 2 drops so you can have that consistency and be aggressive. 3 drops are not too hard to get in this meta. 3 drops have been, you know, pretty common for a while now. 1 drops, that'll also depend on the quality of 1 drops because there's a huge difference between the quality of 1 drops. You know, you want your fireflies,
I
glacial
mean,
shards are
look at the
really
tier
good.
list. If a one drop is below a 90, not. I mean, it's
Yeah.
technically a one drop, but your Murloc Raider's not the same as a Crocker Wrap.
No, no, definitely not. But once again, if you're a rogue, you can get away with basically zero
Mm-hmm.
2 drops. It's part of the
Well,
strength of the
no, your
rogue.
rogue, you have all the two drops. Your hero power is your two
Yeah,
drop. You
yeah.
instantly start with infinity two drops, and you're guaranteed to have it.
And it's why rogue is one of the best classes right now.
Mm-hmm.
But for other classes, you know, you do want that consistency. So the numbers I throw out, those are, you know, rough numbers.
All right.
And some classes like also get them easier, right? Like druids have naturally good 2 drops, so it is easier for them.
Okay, so what Merp says is totally true and correct, and if you understood and comprehended all of that, listen to him, not what I'm about to say. What I'm about to say is that you don't have to get into that level of preciseness, especially if you're getting 3 wins when it comes to what curve is. Just understand that curve fundamentally means I get to do something on the turn. I get to do something with my turn 2. A lot better than not doing something with turn 2, right? So there's no magic number, but at a certain point, the diminishing returns of adding more 2 drops into your deck gets like worse, right? Gets like not worth it compared to other stuff. So these numbers represent some percent chance that you get to have the card on that turn. So you play a 2, 3 drop on, 4 drop on. That's all they represent. So people are like, oh, in this meta, what is it? In that meta, what is it? It never changes because it's just math, right? Like you may change in different metas how you draft because there's fewer 2 drops. You have to draft them more aggressively, or there's fewer 2 drops. You're never going to curve out, so just forget about it. Just start on 3. But in order to have a curve, it's always 6 solid 1/normal 2 drops. So like your Argent Squires are solid 1 drops. Your Murloc Raiders not so much. And then 5 3 drops, 4 4 drops, 2 5 drops, nothing after 5 drops. That's your curve, and that never ever 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 changes. Now, people, he's also asked this question. It's like, what if I want an aggro deck or a control deck? What's the curve I'm looking for then? Well, there's no answer to that question because everything's relative. Like I said, it was math. I just gave you the math for when the diminishing returns hits. So push it as far ahead as you want or pull it back as much as you want. But no matter if you're a control, no matter how much of a control deck you are, curve still gives you the initiative to like fight on the board. Like you may be losing the board, but having stuff to play is better than not having stuff to play. So no matter how control you are, I always recommend you, like you may want to start your curve on 3 and not 2, but then still have enough to be on curve for the entire thing and have a couple more 3 drops because you know you're going to coin the 3 drop in that case. But the fundamentals don't change. It's they're numbers and math.
All right. So the next common mistake that I see beginners make is keeping comeback cards in their mulligan. So there's going to be like mistakes that I will be highlighting in each of the groupings. But the number one mulligan mistake I see for beginner players is they like to keep comeback cards,
So you're
which
not supposed to keep a flame strike in your hand?
it's one of the things that you see, and maybe they're latching onto the time they saw Crip or Hafu do it with like a very specific deck, right? And it could definitely be correct.
Notice how Merp says Crip or Hafu, because we never do it. We like literally never do it. There are some players who will do it like
super rare.
now and then, like when the stars align. We never do. Like it's kind of almost like a policy, right? Like I'll keep a spell stone.
Right.
That's about it.
And if you're a beginner player, it will always be incorrect. It will just always be incorrect. You should be drafting for curve, and you should be playing towards curve. I see a lot of beginner players, see this really strong card. It could be Flame Strike, it could be Meteor. They see it and they're
but
like,
the
"Oh, I
Lightforge
want
tier
this
list
as
rates
an
it at
insurance
200.
policy." I know.
Why would I want the chance to not ever draw that card?
I mean, so, and what a lot of players don't understand is by keeping it, you are, number one, resigning yourself and playing towards you being behind, number one. And number two,
So
you're
let me
just
explain how that works. You're playing towards being behind because the card that you have cannot be played. And you only have 3 cards to start, so a third of your cards can't be played, which means your options go from 3 to 2, which means it drops by 33%. So you are effectively handicapping your ability to influence the game by 33%. You draw a card at the beginning of the next turn, fine, 25%. But you're taking a 25% handicap on your ability to play the game. 25% is a huge freaking percentage. Like, imagine if you lost 25% more of your games. That's probably what that would like end up resulting in.
Yep. So, once again, comeback cards, to some players, it might feel as though it's like, oh man, but if I get behind, I have this really powerful card. You are like, by doing that, you are playing towards going behind. So don't do that. And then finally, the last mistake that I see beginner players make too often is going face too much. We don't have to talk too much about this just because we've talked about this a lot. Beginner players like to go face, and they get punished a lot for it. And especially in this meta, there is a decent amount of punishes. You will always get punished, and sometimes it will be the correct option to go face, with some very aggressive decks,
but
perhaps.
Merps, I'm a Lightforge listener, and I watch the Grinning go, and I see Merps go face all the time.
Yes,
that's like
Merps does
half
like to do
the
that.
moves that Merps makes. Why shouldn't it be half the moves I make?
Well, you know what? Merps has evaluated when the move is statistically beneficial, and sometimes Merps gets punished too, right? You're playing with fire here, and you need to be a professional fire handler, right, in order to do that. And as a beginner, if you keep on making trades, will you lose some games because you overtrade? Yes, but on average, a decent percentage, right? But on average, you will lose a lot less than if you just went face all the time. And then you got Death Speaker, you got Corpse Razored.
So if you're thinking about it in terms of game theory, think about it like this. Every time that, let's say half the time you're supposed to go face, half the time you're supposed to trade, right? If you're supposed to trade and you trade, you get a point. If you're supposed to go face and you go face, you get a point. If you're supposed to go face and you trade, you get half a point. So it's not as good. You're going to fall behind if you do that. If you're supposed to trade and you go face, you lose 5 points. That's the punish. So if you really know when you're supposed to go face, you should go face. Why? Because otherwise you're losing half a point, and that's going to add up. That's going to cause you a lot of losses. But if you're at all unsure about it, if you don't have that level of grasp of when to go face and when not to go face, that's the difference between losing half a point and losing 5 points. So that's kind of the setup. And I'm only exaggerating a little bit here. Like, the punish for going face is like really harsh. It could be in the form of a board clear. It could be in the form of getting a better trade. It could be something like a buff or a death speaker. It could be your opponent actually being more aggressive than you and swinging to your face and you losing health, them taunting up, and you realize, like, oh crap, I'm going to lose the face race now. It could be a whole host of things. And once you go face, you kind of commit yourself to it. So you got to have some reads, you got to know your deck, all that.
Yep. All right. So that kind of wraps up the common mistakes for beginners. All right. And I think we can move on to common mistakes for intermediate players. And by intermediate players, these are players who aren't just your sort of like,
you can
players
tell
that
how
play
skewed Merps' system is. Your beginners are the ones that win half your games. Your intermediate players are the ones that are soft infinite, right? Like, you almost get to play the game for free. I mean, you do get to play the game for free.
Yeah. The intermediate players are I would say the 4 to 5 win players.
Yeah,
right?
soft infinite.
Soft, like very.
Yeah, like borderline soft infinite.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Like, if you play one arena a day, complete all your quests with the new amount of gold that the quests give you, you can always play an arena.
And it's also just because, like, for the beginners, I sort of categorize as 2 to 3 wins. If you are averaging less than 2 wins, like I said, you just don't know the game well enough. And also, you're just not paying attention. That's the thing.
Yeah.
Like, all you have to do is just slow down. And if you're average, like, I've seen the post as well. Someone's just like, yeah, I average like 1 win. What can I do? Consult a tier list and slow down. That's it. Like, as long as you understand the game, slow down a little bit, you should average at least 2 wins. That's it. And there are players who like average less than that, and it's just because they're at, like, on the treadmill, and all they want to do is just like play some cards, right? That's it. They just want to play some cards. So we get to intermediate players, and the first common mistake I see intermediate players do, and it's an expansion of the first point for beginner players. So beginner players do not acknowledge the next turn. Intermediate players do not plan for the next turn properly, right? And what this means is, okay, so intermediate players see the Boulderfist Ogre there, knows that it'll kill their 5/5 on the board, but they have not properly looked at all of their options and really evaluate, okay, well, what is the best option taking this into effect, right? And also, like, well, there's the next turn afterwards, so I kind of want to play my 2/2/2, but at the same time I kill all my flexibility for the next turn, right? So the first common mistake I see is just not properly planning for the next turn. Intermediate players identify what could happen, but they don't properly analyze that situation. And I don't need to get too much into this, because if you want to go over how to properly analyze a turn, that was episode 94, where I went through my mental checklist, right? So we don't have to go super into it, but yeah, that is number 1 on the list for common mistakes for intermediate players.
Yeah, totally agree.
All right.
I mean, that's common mistakes we all make, but less
it
frequently.
It is.
You're on top of it.
So mistake number 2, or common mistake number 2 for intermediate players, is relying too much on swing cards.
Mm-hmm.
And this is within the draft, which means that they draft them a little bit too highly, and also within the game, which means they either hold or they try to play swing cards in a cute way, right? So I've seen a lot of intermediate players sort of overdraft or overvalue cards like BGH or EMP operative, right? So stuff like that. And what they'll do is, these are also the players who will, instead of playing the MCT on turn 3 to just put out a 3/3, they'll hold on to it and try to get that value. And sometimes it'll work, right? Sometimes they should have lost the game, but because they held on to it, they win, and they hit the 25% to get the huge minion, right? But by relying doubly, within the draft to just draft these cards high, and within the game on these swing cards, you're holding yourself back
Yeah.
from getting higher wins.
So it's not to say like, because at a certain win rate, and I don't know what the exact number would be, drafting really high swing cards is an excellent plan for winning more games. Why?
Mm-hmm.
Because you need it to win. Because you win a game if you EMP a giant thing, and so you might as well go for it, right? If the rest of your win rate is like 30%, and if you EMP, your win rate goes up to 90%, that's really good. If the rest of your win rate is 75%, and if you EMP something, it goes to 92%, and not really doing you that much, right? Like, and you may think, oh, but that's fine, right? Like, I'll just use this card and it'll be fine. But just even having it in your deck makes you worse at the other stuff, and so you get less rewards for the other stuff, and then you trust the other stuff less, and then you grow as a player less, and you're really like at around 5 wins, you're really on the cusp of these swing cards turning from like decent cards. I would say 3 to 5 wins. Swing cards, like giant swing cards, are decent cards to play. Below 3 wins, they're really good cards to play. But you're on the cusp of turning these cards from being decent to play to being subpar. Like you really got to be offered some unfitting cards for your deck to be taking these giant swings.
Yep. So that's a warning on swing cards as well, and it's easy to see the allure of them because they're they're bombs, right? And a lot of people just want to play these bombs. Like a lot of people want the dream of EMP operative on that bulldozer, right? But once again, relying too much on it.
In this meta, you can have like a little bit of the taste and like not be like, even if you're the best players, right?
Oh yeah, of course.
Because Blood Knight and Mossy Horror exist.
Yeah.
Dragon Slayer exists. So
of course,
like,
and I'll touch upon this a little bit later as well.
okay.
But
like save your drafts and your like excitement for like those cards. No need to take the even more swingy cards.
So all right, let's talk again about the mulligan, because this is also a topic that I want to touch upon for all three of these categories. So while the beginner player keeps comeback cards too often, intermediate players just don't plan out their mulligan curve as much. So what I see intermediate players do is they will keep playable cards or keep playable minions, but they won't turn plan their mulligan properly. And I would say the mulligan is also something that is consistently underrated by players, or they just don't realize how much of an impact that has on your win rate. It's people like obsess over the draft. And then they also understand, obviously, playing has a huge impact. But this mulligan, it's something that just happens really quickly, right? It's like after the draft, before the game, it's like, oh, let's just sort of get this over with. Sure, I'll keep this card. I won't keep that card. Obviously, this goes back in, etc. But it has a huge effect on your win rate. And what I see intermediate players do is just not take the time and say, it's like, okay, how many ones do I have? What are my chances of getting that? Or if I have a one, do I have a coin or not? That impacts what I keep. And then what am I going to do? Like, what do my first 3 turns look like potentially? And how can I make those the best possible so that I start my snowball and I have an advantage over my opponent? So intermediate players, it's not like they don't care at all about the mulligan, but they don't turn plan their mulligan and play the odds in like the most advantageous way that they should be.
Totally agree. And the mulligan's such a hard part. I like that you picked the mulligan for one of these things to carry through. Because even when you get to like advanced play, if you ever see us co-op with like each other or other people, like half the time we're not even mulliganing the same. Not half the time, maybe like a quarter of the time. But it's definitely a place with a big impact on the game, and like a lot of ways to actually do it. And something intermediate players do is they're not there yet. They're not thinking about it as the big thing that it is.
Yeah, definitely. All right. So the last thing, and this is a general, it's a very broad kind of mistake that intermediate players do, but it's getting too fancy. right? And I separated this from the swing cards, in which the swing cards are sort of, like individualized instances. But what I see a little, like what I see a lot in intermediate players is they like to sort of get a little bit fancy in setting up the AoEs, or get a little bit greedy when it comes to, it's like, oh, but I can get a better AoE here or there. And part of it can perhaps come from just wanting that bomb to be a little bit bigger, or it can come from watching streamers sort of do some fancy plays, right? Like just about a month ago, I was watching Ratsma play this Control Priest, and he did some really fancy plays, like what looked to be very risky, right? And he explained it. He's like, well, because my deck is built this way, because I've made this read on my opponent, I'm going to do this. And like to an observer, the chance of the punish was extremely high, but he, never really got punished for it. And it's because he, properly assessed the risk. For myself, the Druid run that I'm currently on, there was because the deck was so sick and I had a Spreading Plague in my hand, there were 2 turns in a row where all I did was hero power the Paladin's face. And I was just like, because of the cards in his hand and because what's going to happen, I'm not going to kill his 1/1s. I'm not even going to play stuff. I'm just going to wait to Spreading Plague and then Power of the Wild, all of that, because I know he doesn't have a punish for it. And he didn't. But these are the kind of plays that I think people latch onto, and they're like, I can do that too. And it's like, you could, but you're probably not doing the risk assessment properly. And if you want it to be a learning experience, that's fine. Like, just make sure you remember if you get punished and what happens. But this is a common mistake that I see intermediate players do, where they try to replicate these greedy / fancy plays and then kind of get confused when it doesn't work out with the frequency that they see that streamers do.
Yep.
All right. So that is intermediate players. Did you have anything to add there, or should I?
Nope. I mean, I'm just an intermediate player, so I'm just taking notes here.
Yeah. Good. Well, thankfully, this is recorded, and you can reference this at any given moment. All right, now we get to advanced players, and these are players who are soft infinite, maybe infinite players, but players who perhaps, like, all right, so these are players that are, not leaderboard players, but definitely very, very good already, right? We're talking like top percentile. So these are mistakes that I would say I see, because I've also coached and I've played with some players who are just like, yeah, I average 6 wins, I average 6.5 wins, and these are the most, I would say, specific and nuanced mistakes that I see. So the most common mistake that I see for these players that are, like at the cusp, right? The first mistake is not making enough reads and not trusting those reads. So notice I didn't talk about reads at all for beginner or intermediate players, because that is just one of the last things.
Turn planning. You don't need to make a single read to average 5 wins.
No, definitely.
Single one. You
do need to turn plan.
You do need to turn plan, but that's like you're basically playing like solitaire and then looking at your opponent's board, right? Your opponent is just a computer.
Exactly. Yeah. So, well, once again, in order to be an intermediate, like, average 5 wins or so, you just have to play your own deck well, right? You have to draft your own deck like well. You have to play it in a way that takes advantage of your deck and your.
You have to have a basic understanding of what your win conditions are for every deck you.
Definitely. And then when you are infinite or pushing infinite, all right, so this is where you need to eke out all these advantages, right? This is where you have to make your reads. And once again, it's too long of a topic. You can listen to previous Lightforges.
We had a couple of Lightforges that involved making.
Right. And so once again, make those reads, learn from them, and trust your reads. We always say here, there's no point in making reads if you're not going to trust your reads as well. So trust your reads. That's the first common mistake that I see advanced players make. And number two is remember for intermediate players, we talked about how intermediate players sort of take too much risk. They rely too much on swing cards. Soft infinite players slash advanced players, a lot of them don't take enough risk.
They're not going
You know,
face enough because at this
well,
point, like you got the like you know the game well enough because you are where you are that you should be trying to do the things like you should be taking that risk that you get punished and lose 5 points instead of just saying like okay I'll lose half a point.
yes. So going face, that was sort of a sub thing to this, but we can talk about that first. We can talk
Oh,
about that
okay.
first. So yes, one of the things that if you want to be a leaderboard player, right? You know, if you want to be a cream of the crop, you have to identify the times in which using your scenario, right? The +1 or -5
Mm-hmm.
scenario, right? You have to capture those +1s where you can. That's it.
Because
And
if it's random, you'd never take the chance, right? But the
no, no,
point
no, no.
is that at every specific moment, there is a right answer and there is a wrong answer. And so if you're just consistently getting the right answers, who cares what the ratio is, right? Like if someone's giving you really terrible odds, but you're gonna win the bet anyway, you don't really care what odds you're gonna get. You're gonna make the bet regardless at the end of the day, right?
Yeah, definitely. So, and this is a very kind of like poker mentality, right? It's like as long as you have the odds in your favor, like you're going to win out. And it also depends on your deck and your, you know, like your tolerance for risk as well. But as a beginner player, I would say, you know, you want to definitely like you want to trade unless you can think of like a very specific reason that you know you should go face, right? Let's say as a beginner player, you're just like, okay, I need to trade, but then you're like, wait, I'm a hunter, and if I just go face, I bring him down to 2 HP, and you know, like I force him to have a heal,
Mm-hmm.
right? As an advanced player, you know the game and you've played it so well. The general rule for you is if you can't think of a punish, you should just go face. And it also helps build this exercise in that it forces you to think of the punishes, right? Like it like so you know if you are able to sort of tolerate some losses as well or just like learn a few lessons, keep on doing this exercise. Like if you can't think of punishes, whether it's a specific card or just a category of cards, right? And then the range of you know cards that can hurt you. Um, if you can't think of it, just go face. Because most of the time, if you're that good, what's holding you back really isn't like the possible responses. It's really this fear, and this fear amplifies the percent chance of punish that you think is going to happen. When in reality, it's a lot lower than what you think it's going to be.
So I have a 5% rule, which means if something has less than a 5% chance of happening, it has a 0% chance of happening. And that rule is there because, as you guys know, I don't think very well. Like
No,
I think good, but I don't think fast. And you're making me think about a lot of stuff in a turn. I'm gonna rope. I'm gonna mess up. It's not gonna be good, right? So I try to clear as much space in my head as possible. And rather than analyze something like down a rabbit hole, at some point you're just like, well, it's below 5%. That's a risk that I just automatically take. And you can set these kind of things. So when Merps is saying like you have to know the punish, I never think about specific cards except like the top like two most specifically punishing things. Like I'll think about a Shadow Man, right? I'll think about a Mind Control. I'll think about a Flame Strike. But I'm never sitting there thinking about like epic cards, right? Like I'm never sitting around there thinking about like cards that are rated below a 100 on the tier list, even if they're like super punishing in that exact situation. You're just not gonna see those cards a lot. Instead, I focus on the broadest category, like would a buff punish me, and would a removal punish me, would a board clear punish me, and there's only maybe 6 of these categories that I consider. It's usually something like removal, board clear, buff, taunt, more minions, and if I'm deciding if they're going face or not, whether he can go face. That's just 6 things, right? Like that, like if he can win the face race, that's just 6 things. And because you limit the world so much into just 6 things, you can have really good reads on those 6 things. Because every turn that goes by, you're in your opponent's head and you go, do I have these 6 things? If I had these things, if I had all of them, which one would I play? What order would I play them in to maximize my advantage? And then, based on which one they do play, you know they don't have any of the ones above it. So, if a single target removal is the best in this case, and this was not played, instead, and then let's say like a taunt was the second best, and instead the opponent like buffed. So you can either think my opponent made a misplay, but really what you should be thinking is my opponent has no buffs, my opponent has no single target removal. You just got 2 freaking amazing reads on your opponent. Right? Like, that's the kind of like punishing system, and it links into your reads, and you're basically always playing 2 games at the same time, one for your opponent and one for you. But when you're playing on your opponent's side, you're doing it for a reason. You're doing it to get your reads, and you're doing it to get your reads so that you can know the punishes. And when you're checking off the punishes, like, oh, can't be punished by a single removal. Why? Because he doesn't have one. You can get a lot more aggressive. You can have a lot more confidence in doing the things you want to do. So all of a sudden, decisions become very easy, and you're not just playing conservative.
Right. Also, another easy way to do this is like if you're thinking about buffs. For some people, I know it's like, oh, it's like, well, buffs. There's so many buffs. I have no idea. You can just think it's like, okay, well, does a bone mare punish me? Does a fungal mancer punish me? And like 90% of the rest of them are just weaker versions.
Exactly.
Those, right. It's like, okay, well, there's fungal and then there's bone mare, and you guys should be able to see how those are different, right? And then if those 2 aren't punishing, then you're pretty much good, because then we're getting into like pretty specific things, right?
Like Death Speaker was the big wrench when that came out, because there didn't used to be a card that did that except in Paladin. Now it's something to kind of consider, but you don't see the card like enough for me to really worry about it. Like, I never specifically consider a Death Speaker punish. I kind of wrap that in with the whole, like, oh, what if it gets 2 extra health, right?
Yeah, definitely. So, once again, this is, in order to get that last bit and to advance into the upper echelon of arena players, you have to basically identify the times in which you need to go face, and then you got to go face. But past that, I see a lot of advanced players also not taking enough risk when they're sort of like drafting cards, and also sort of like because a lot of players get to that point by playing stable, right? Like they play stable, and it's because like they were the players that realized I got to trade. They were the players who realized it's like, okay, I can't just win on BGH all the time, right? And then they got to that point by playing stable. But to, once again, just like how going face gives you those last percentages, you need to manipulate the probabilities in the draft and in the game and capitalize on that as well. Because the game has changed, and Boomsday is fairly stable, but this is not like 2 years ago where you can just Yeti it up and win through Yetis, right? You have to embrace the risk, and it could be something as small as Mad Bomber percentages, or it could be something as big as some like Servant of Yogg-Saron-esque card, right? Like I know we don't have those anymore, but
are you forgetting about Scroll?
I mean, there's Scroll, but I think Scroll is a little bit closer to, because you can control when you play it, right? And then I think Scroll has less effect. Like it's less of a, I don't know what the hell is going to happen.
No, I'm thinking of, I think I said the
Deck of Wonders.
Yeah, I think of Deck of Wonders.
Yeah, I mean, but then you have to
scrolls
draft
into your.
I know, but I'm like, no, I thought of Deck of Wonders as well.
And then you're like, but clearly, anyone who listens to the Lightforge podcast would never ever draft that card.
Yeah, I mean, I would say please just do not draft it. But yeah, I mean, there are certainly craziness going on, right? And this is what I mean. You might not draft Deck of Wonders, but your opponent might draft Deck of Wonders, and you are definitely going to lose to draft, like to Deck of Wonders. If you
Yeah,
play enough games, I've lost to Deck of Wonders.
definitely.
Definitely. But this is also why you need to embrace an appropriate amount of RNG, an appropriate amount of craziness. And it also means that in the mulligan, going back there once again. So beginners, remember we said they keep comeback cards way too often. Intermediate players, they mess up while mulliganing for a curve. And in this, and once again, in the risk analysis for advanced players, I see what I see the most is advanced players don't take enough risks in the mulligan as well. Because here's what happens with advanced players. These are the people who, once you are getting into those high wins, you are the kind of players who will find this scenario more often. Like your deck is just inferior quality wise to other players.
Yep.
Beginner player and intermediate players, this will happen, but at a much lower percent chance. So you have to identify like these times in which you have a bottom 20% value deck, right?
And
let's say
you're
bottom
6-1.
Yeah, and you're 6-1. So like once you go into the next game, right? And let's say you're like a bottom 20% value hunter deck, even. Like something I'm very familiar with. So you go into the game, and in your mulligan, one of the cards is a River Croc, right? Depending on your deck and depending on how good it is, depending on how many ones you have, sometimes you just can't keep that River Croc, even though it's a 2, because you say, well, I have a decent amount of 2s. I need to trust that I get a 2 back, but I really just need to fish for my 1s, and especially a really powerful 1.
Yeah,
It's to the
and if
point
you're going
where
first, like
Yeah.
having 2/2 drops in your hand is kind of bad because you can't.
It's bad.
Like if you have 3 2/2 drops, it'll count as a 4 drop. But otherwise, like what are you gonna do with that other 2 drop? It's like equivalent to a dead card until turn 5. Would you keep a 5 drop in your hand? You definitely wouldn't.
Right.
So if
And
you have
your
enough
fear
2s and you have enough 1s, but not so many, like you don't have an absurd amount of ones. It's not like you have 8 1s in your deck, you have like 4. Gotta fish.
You gotta fish for it. And this is something that I see a little bit too often in advanced players as well. They play it too safe in the draft. They play it too safe in the mulligan, and they play it too safe on the board as well. So once again, you can just say, Merps, you're basically saying they don't do advanced risk assessment correctly. Yes, totally. And this game is all about risk assessment. But once again, I want to highlight these are, and look, mistakes will be individual to the individual, right? Like they will, not everyone makes the same mistakes, but these are very common sort of mistakes that I would say, if you lumped sort of these players together, if you bucketed them, these would be the mistakes that you would find the most often. And it just makes sense because of how these players get to this point, right? Mm-hmm. So if you're listening and if you're within one of these buckets, just think about your game at its current state and be like, well, does Merps have a point? Like, am I relying too much on swing cards? And that's the reason why I'm stuck at 5 wins, right? Like, because I love BGH and I just got drafted every single time. It feels great when it hits. God, I can't even think of targets for BGH. It's like Violet Worm. I don't know. They get all the 1/1s. But yeah. Sea Giant. Oh, true. Sea Giant is a good thing. But for and for advanced players, we've talked about it a lot, but once again, it's just adding all of these things together and also highlighting just the importance of mulligan. Mm-hmm. You never stop getting better at the mulligan.
Yep.
That is something, and your mistakes will differ. And once again, if you're a beginner player, you can also just remember all of these. It's not something that it's like, oh, I haven't reached 5 wins yet. I can't think about mulliganing for a curve just yet. But these are things in which I see holding players back the most.
Yeah, but watch your mental space. Like if you're at 3 wins, like here's how I would sum it up. If you're at 3 wins, play the game on the board. Like just know what can happen and analyze that. If you're at 5 wins, like analyze what could happen from your opponent's hand. Analyze what could happen on the in the future. And if you're at like 6, 7 wins, like figure out how you are going to lose the game and not do that, and figure out how you are going to win the game and do that. Which
Also,
if you
yeah.
told a 3-win player to do that, they're gonna be like, like what does that even mean, right? Like take less damage, deal more damage, right? Like win the board. I don't know. But if you're a 6 or 7 win player, hopefully you know what we mean when we say that. Like because that's the next step. Because in order to win the game and not lose the game, you have to do a lot of things that you would normally not do on a per turn basis, right? Like if I just like showed you a turn and didn't give you any context for it with like what your deck is or what reads you have on your opponent, and told you play out this turn, the objectively correct answer is going to be wrong a good percentage of time once you add all the context. And that's where you have to like really be able to pick up everything that's different.
Yep. All right. So those are it. Want to go through some common mistakes that players make.
So I want to add something, which is the opposite of that, which is what not to think about, just really quickly, because you talk a lot of stuff about what to think about, and that's great, and it's good areas to focus. But what I also find is, especially when it comes to 5-win players and above, that there's just like too many thoughts in their heads, and they're like not very good at organizing them in a way. So it just ends up being like, well, I could do this or this. I guess they're both okay. Like I'm gonna do one of them, or they have like a
Yes,
preference, right?
that is absolutely what players get stuck
Yeah,
on.
like
Yep.
especially if you get to like you're at like 5 or 6 wins, your preference is usually trade. Why? Because it's usually when you don't know which is the right move. So don't think about all of the stuff that you're very very good at. Like that's the step one to not like if you want to improve at the game. The first thing you have to stop doing is doing things like spotting lethal or like basically anything the puzzle labs that's out right now is like trying to get you to think about. Don't think about any of them because that like takes a lot of math, and I guess some people are better at arithmetic than others, but it's still brain processing power, right? Even if you can do it really fast, it slows you down for your later thoughts, and you want like all of your best thoughts at the beginning with all your most the most energy that you. So like stop looking, stop counting, like do very basic counting and things like that. And instead focus in on your reads, focus in on your win conditions, focus in on what you want to happen to the game and what your opponent wants to happen to the game. What your opponent doesn't want to happen to the game. What you want to happen to the game, but also what you don't want to happen to the game. And once you have that figured out, like then start counting your numbers, then start looking, for like lethal, unless it's like the more obvious kinds of lethal where you've been setting it up for a couple turns. So there's an order of operations here that slowly changes, right? Like when you're a beginning player, what you shouldn't think about is stuff like getting a good read or making a fancy play. That's going to be very complicated for you, take up a lot of your precious resources, and you don't need it to get a higher win rate. You just play the board. But as you get more advanced, those specific things that you were getting better at, like trading math, like preventing lethal, like dealing lethal, just like the more basic stuff, rather than say, well, I'm really good at it, so I'm going to do it first. Say, I trust that I can do it okay, and that's no longer what's getting me the higher like win rate. And instead, focus on the other stuff for the bulk of your. Like I think that'll help you process. Now, if you're going through a turn and you're like, I think of everything, and I'm still fine, then fine, don't listen to this advice. But I think most of us are human, and Hearthstone, especially these days, it gets pretty complicated. Like I'm roping now, like when I play solo, more often than I've ever roped. It's complicated, and you need to be spending more time thinking about the advanced stuff and less time thinking about the basic stuff. Or conversely, if you're not there yet, you need to spend more time thinking about the basic stuff and not worry about the advanced.
Yep. And generally, when players get stuck with all of these options, something that they can do to break out of the, well, I have option A, B, and C, but they all seem fine. Um, a lot of players get stuck on sort of like what the card is. So I like when I coach players, I'll ask them, it's like, okay, well, what are we doing this turn? And they'll be like, well, I could do this card, or this card. And I'm like, okay, so walk me through it. They're like, well, they all seem okay. Like, this card is good, this card is good. And they never, like go past the fact that this card is this card. And then I always ask them, like, okay, all right. So from this point onwards, we're gonna go like Matrix style, right? Like you need to see the code
Mm-hmm.
behind all of this stuff. A Yeti is not a Yeti, right? Like that's not it. A Yeti doesn't mean anything. It doesn't do anything. A fire plume,
Oh,
I know. A fire plume
oh,
phoenix, like what does it mean? What does it do? And something like a giggling inventor, what like what does it do, right? So get past the point where, and this is where players get stuck when I ask them to evaluate cards. They're like, well, this card is good, this card is also
yeah.
good. They're
Like
just
never,
evaluating.
your tier
Yeah,
list value stops mattering once you like. Don't ever look at a card and be like, it's a good card or it's a bad card. That's wasted thought. No matter what like skill level you are, that's always wasted thought.
yeah. So once you're in the game, distill the card into its
Mm-hmm.
characteristics and what it offers when you're going through the decision making process. So, for example, a primordial drake, you think about what it offers, the taunt, the 4 attack, the 2 damage AoE, and then how that impacts everything, right? It's, and a lot of players just get stuck looking at it's almost as if they're looking at through the draft
Yeah,
lenses, like you said,
exactly. Yeah,
right?
because they
Yeah,
look at it as a package because it's presented to you as a package, right? It's not presented to you as 4 attack, 5 health, 4 mana. It's presented to you as a Yeti, and you know what a Yeti is, but
right,
it's not helpful to think about it as a Yeti.
right. And
Um,
then the sub characters is like cannot attack this turn, right? And
mhm,
what does that mean? It doesn't taunt. What does that mean?
yeah,
Yeah, just break down cards into characteristics, and that should help with your turn planning a lot better.
yeah. No, that's a really good point. I think that a lot of people definitely are not as, and it's something you have to train yourself in. It doesn't come like naturally, I think, to anybody. I think it'd be kind of weird if it came naturally to you that like you just look at a card and you're like, okay, so I get 4 tempo attack in the board, and no, you think of it as Yeti. So you have to train yourself to like break it down first. Every card always, to never think of cards as what they are. So if you notice, like especially when new sets are released, so often like I don't just like not know its name. I don't know anything about the card. I don't know what sounds it makes. I don't know anything about it, but I will describe it to you as like, oh, that 3 mana 2/1 that has 2/1/1s with it. Because that's how I think about the card, right? Picture doesn't matter, the sounds don't matter, the name doesn't matter. Like as long as I'm vaguely describing what its tempo and card advantage and reach and survivability characteristics are, I'm playing it right.
Yep.
All right. So I think that's a good overview of a bunch of common mistakes and how to avoid it and how to really like go take the next step, right? Because improving in the game is not the same for everybody, depending on where you are on your journey to becoming a infinite player or a top player. Um, okay, let's move on to question from the goat. Question from the goat. We are recording this. This is not live because Merps will be gone for 2 weeks. Where are you headed off to, Merps?
All right. So I will be gone for about a week and a half. I'll be going to Prague, Vienna, and Budapest. If you guys have recommendations for sites a little bit off the beaten path, and especially food recommendations in
Mm,
any of those cities, tweet at me, Merps4248. Definitely want to you know, just eat a ton of good food. So hit me up with those recommendations. But we have about 3 days in each city. Haven't been yet. Very excited.
awesome. Yeah. Um, So, what are you most excited about besides the food?
I have no idea.
Just the
I know
food.
nothing about these cities. Well, like for example, Prague and Budapest. I've heard that those are very walkable cities,
Hmm.
right? Like there are cities in which obviously there's a lot of culture, but there are places in which you just kind of like walk around, take in the culture, and it's one of those vacations that I'm going to obviously get to see some sights, get some culture, but it's going to be one of those sort of like vacations in which I'm not rushing from like place to
Right.
place.
Yeah.
Right, I get to
You
just
just
sit,
kind of want
have
to
some
exist
coffee.
in like a different place
Exactly,
than where you normally in DC.
exactly.
Yeah. And I'm sure some of our listeners, at least a couple, are going to be from these cities or have spent a significant part of their lives in these cities. So definitely let Merps know. All right, this question from the GOAT brought to you by our Patreons at patreon.com/grinninggoat. Thank you guys so much for your support. Yeah, we'll wrap this up with Card Good Bad. I picked the Card Good Bad this week, and I picked Spark Engine, which is kind of like a deep dive into. It's rated a 105, so we're not going to say it's good, and we're not going to say it's bad. And depending on who you are, I think you may look at this card and think, "Oh, it's a totally good 2 drop," or "Oh, it's utter trash." It is the 2 mana 2/1 mech that puts a 1/1 rush mech for 1 mana into your hand. So you get like a boar, and you have a 2 mana 2/1. Now, if you think about it, a 2 mana 2/1 summons you a loot hoarder. So getting a card out of it, a real card, right? Boar is a real card. It's not like a super understated card. It's not a good card, but it's not like a half a card. It's a decent proposition. But the real benefit to the card comes from the fact that you get it immediately. So you can also use this card on any turn after turn 2 as a 1 damage removal. So for 3 mana to have a 2/1 and to deal 1 damage, well, that's still crap, right? But now you have options. And where this card really, really gets its value, and when I say it gets its value, I mean it becomes an okay card. We rated a 105, it's like a legit 2 mana pick. Where it really gets its value is in its like very high flexibility. And I know a lot of people complain about the tier list, and they're like things like Razor Pedal Volley should be much higher, or like Razor Pedal Lasher should be much higher. Like, I think your algorithm is broken or whatever. The algorithm is not broken. You can tell from Spark Engine. Spark Engine is rated a 105. It's not any higher than that. It's not much lower than that. I've been screwed by this card played against me, and I've used it to decent effect. But other times it's like a kind of underwhelming 2 mana card. It is what it is. Um, the main issue is that this card is like if you look at Razor Pedal Lasher, right? That's I think Blizzard rates it pretty in a pretty premium way, and that's in Rogue where you don't need a 2 mana drop at all to have your weapon. And here, Spark Engine kind of does the same thing, just with a 2/1 instead of a 2/2. And all of a sudden, no one is terribly excited about it, right? So I don't know. It's just a very interesting card.
Yeah, I will say I haven't seen this card a lot. You seem to see this card
Mm-hmm.
more than me. Although I mean, I guess you just play more than me as well. But I haven't really been impacted by this card. I have no like strong feelings towards it. I think it's appropriate. Just pings in general are decent, right? And also small cards that generate another small card are also fairly good because you don't sort of commit the entire card to the board and just get it like wiped,
Yeah.
right? So it's something good. Like people routinely underestimate the value of a small card that generates another small card. Look at Firefly, right? I mean, Firefly is like the premier example of it. But in this case, it has that Firefly effect.
Like you remember Echoing Ooze? It's a 2 mana 1/2 that summons a copy of itself
Yeah,
from like back
of
in the
course.
day. People are like,
Yeah.
"Oh, Firefly's kind of like that," but no. Firefly splits the body up, lets you play it on multiple turns, and can be played on turn 1. And so now that's the difference between a very mediocrely average card in all classes not named Paladin to like a premium one drop, right? Like a premium card in the meta, even if it weren't an element. That's the difference. That's the difference when you split things up.
Yeah, definitely. Although it would be interesting to see Echoing Ooze in this meta, right? In which there's some classes have a decent amount of buffs. That was just a different era back then, in which you were looking for the dream of Echoing Ooze, like turn 6 Echoing Ooze, Blessing of Kings, right?
Yeah,
that was the dream,
that
and
was
it
the
happens
dream.
sometimes.
But
other
now
than
you
that,
have
it's
like
like
a Stegodon. Yeah, Steed.
yeah, you have Steed, and for just 2 extra mana, you have double Steed,
Mhm.
right? Or turn 10 Echoing Ooze into Bone Mare.
Yeah. Mhm.
So it's just something stupid, or Echoing Ooze into like Sound the Bells, right? And you can just like
Oh God. Okay. Yeah.
yeah. So or Echoing Ooze into like an elixir for priest, right? And you just elixir, and then you get like double divine shield or something like. There's a lot of. Now that you bring it up, I'm like, man, that card would be really annoying in this meta. Like,
Yeah.
really, really annoying.
All right. Well, I think that's it from us. This is the only one we're gonna record. So the week after this, it's gonna be live. Merps is not gonna be here, so
Wow, it's just gonna be you.
I mean, you'll just hear me carrying both sides of the conversation. Like, I'll speak once as ADWCTA, and then like half a time as Merps, and then once more as ADWCTA. It'll be a theatrical experience.
Wow, it's a one man show.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And we're doing this one because I'm super tired today, and I don't want to record 2 of these. But also, so hashtag blame ADWCTA. But also because it's a long ways off. It's like a week and a half off, right? And then we don't get back to the Lightforge for another week. I want to make sure that if this patch hits, by the way, the Boomsday patch has still not hit yet. The first rebucketing has not hit yet. I want to be able to be on top of it if it does hit next week. Which, I don't know, how long are they going to go without rebucketing? Like, they know Giggling Inventor has like constructed issues. Like, they know that needs to be rebucketed. Okay. Anyway, we all wish Merps a lot of enjoyment and relaxation on his vacation. And once again, if you know anything about those cities, what it was, Budapest, Prague, and Vienna, right? Oh, but you'll be fine in Vienna. Yeah, tweet at Merps. Until next time, this is ADWCTA.
This is Merps. See you guys.